One of humanity's dreams is to create a time tunnel and be able to visit different times. Now let's imagine we have a time tunnel and can travel to the past. We want to use this tunnel to go to the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages of Europe. You know that before the birth of Christ, an empire had formed in Europe called the Roman Empire. An empire that at its peak controlled about 20% of the world's population, around 70 million people. This empire stretched from Britain to the Middle East and covered more than 5 million square kilometers. But in 395, this empire was split into two parts, East and West. The eastern part, which was closer to the civilized East, had a better situation and continued to exist. But the western part completely fell apart. Cities fought each other. No one accepted the other, and by 476, nothing was left of the Western Roman Empire, just groups fighting each other. Historians consider this year, 476, as the start of the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, a period where darkness and gloom engulfed Western Europe, and this cursed era continued until the 10th century. In the Dark Ages, when you stepped out of your house, you could be attacked by a bunch of savages at any moment. They'd steal everything you had, and if you were lucky, they'd only beat you up. That's the good scenario. If you were unlucky, they'd kill you or take you as a slave. In some areas during this period, up to 25% of the population were slaves. That's 1 in every 4 people, and these were just the official slaves. Many people were technically free but lived like slaves. In these times, no one showed mercy to anyone. Everyone only cared about their own survival. Food was scarce, clean water was rare, and disease was everywhere. Think about it. Even something as simple as drinking water was a huge challenge. Why? In many places, they threw corpses into the water to get rid of the smell, which contaminated the water. People had to drink wine and beer instead of water because at least those didn't kill them as quickly as contaminated water. It's interesting to know that in the Middle Ages, the average alcohol consumption per capita in Europe was about 100 liters per year per person. That's almost 3 times today's consumption. And it wasn't just because people loved to get drunk. They had to drink alcohol because they didn't have safe water. Do you know what the life expectancy was in this period? Only 25 years. If you made it to 25, it was like you had lived for 100 years. Half of the children born didn't make it past the age of 5. Mothers died during childbirth. Fathers were killed in wars. Life wasn't worth much. And these statistics were for the general population. For the poor and slaves, the situation was much worse. For example, a slave on average lived only 17 years. Imagine, you turn 17 and everyone calls you an old man or old woman. Suppose you are a farmer in the Middle Ages, a farmer working a piece of land with his family. Your only source of income is that land. Don't think you own it though. The lands belong to the lords. And who were the lords? Those with power. You just worked on that land to get a meager living. There was no such thing as holidays. Apart from a few religious occasions in the year, there were no other breaks. If you had a son, he had to start working on the land when he turned 7. A farmer, working from dawn to dusk with his family, doing hard work like plowing, planting, harvesting, and other tough jobs. If you were lucky, you might have a few animals, a cow, a goat, maybe some chickens. These animals were like treasures to you, because as long as they were alive, they gave you milk and eggs, but if they died, you couldn't replace them. It's interesting to know that in those times, a cow was worth about a year's wages for a worker, so if your cow died, it was like losing a year's salary. But someone with this job was considered lucky in the Middle Ages, because at least they didn't have to go out and fight. The lords kept their lands relatively safe, but there were no guarantees. You might suddenly find everyone killed and taken away one day. After all this hard work, you and your family had to give 1/3 of your produce to the Lord just for land taxes. There were other taxes too. For example, if you wanted to cross a bridge, you had to pay a toll, or if you wanted to mill your grain at the Lord's mill, you had to pay a tax for that too. When winter came, that's when you really understood what misery was. Food became extremely scarce. By the end of winter, you'd lose half your weight. Hunger and cold teamed up to kill you. If you survived hunger and cold, there were 1,000 diseases waiting for you. During winters, the death rate increased by about 30%, so if 100 people died in summer, in winter that number would be 130, and these statistics were for normal years. In years of famine, the situation was much worse. You might think, well, you can escape this situation and go somewhere else. But no, if you left the area designated by the Lord, you'd be caught and turned into a slave immediately, so you had to stay there and endure. You might think, well, at least the situation was better in the cities, right? Wrong. Cities were worse than villages. Cities were full of garbage, corpses, cockroaches, and rats, and the stench was everywhere. These conditions created diseases every day. One day it was the plague, the next cholera, and the day after that smallpox. It was like these diseases were competing to see which could kill more people. People living in cities were always expecting an army to come and plunder their city. Men were killed, and women and children were taken as slaves. And don't think this situation lasted only a few years. This hell continued for over 500 years. From 476 to about 1000, Europe was plunged into absolute darkness. No progress, no science, no art, just survival. Let's take a closer look at this period. Do you know what happened in these 500 years? For example, in 541, a disease called the Justinian plague appeared. This disease killed about 50 million people over 200 years. That's almost half the population of Europe and the Middle East. Imagine, 1 out of every 2 people died. This plague was so severe that in some areas it wiped out up to 40% of the population. Imagine you live in a city of 10,000 people. Suddenly, 4,000 people die. The place is full of corpses. There's no one to collect the bodies. The stench is everywhere. Food becomes scarce because there's no one to farm. It's horrifying, isn't it? Or do you know how much war and bloodshed there was during this period? Just in the 8th century, there were over 500 major wars in Europe. Several wars happened every year. It's interesting to know that during this time, fighting was the main job for many men. About 5% of Europe's male population, around 1 million people, were professional warriors. That means 1 in every 20 men had the job of killing others. Another interesting thing is that during this period, literacy almost vanished. Only about 1% of people could read and write, and they were mostly priests and nobles. That means 99% of people couldn't even write their own names. But finally, from around the year 1000, a small light appeared in this darkness. People slowly started to cooperate with each other. First, 2 neighbors united, then 3, and it continued like that. These small alliances laid the foundations for the first medieval cities. Cities like Paris and Brussels emerged from this period. Paris in the year 1000 had only 20,000 people. That's the size of a small town today. But this small city started to grow, and by the year 1300, its population had reached 200,000. That means in 300 years, its population increased tenfold. But don't think that everything suddenly became great. Life was still hard, disease was still rampant, life expectancy was still low, around 31 years, but at least a glimmer of hope had appeared. Back in those days, the church, which had been gaining power for centuries, reached its peak. Saying anything against the church could cost you your life. One of the interesting stories from that time is about Giordano Bruno, an Italian philosopher who, after being imprisoned in horrible dungeons for 8 years, was burned alive in Rome in 1600 for being labeled anti-religious. They say when Bruno was tied to a pole with firewood all around him, he had calmed down and accepted his fate. But suddenly, an old woman came forward with a piece of wood, threw it into the pile, and mumbled, "God, accept this." Bruno suddenly got upset, as if what she did burned him to the core. He shouted at her, "Damn your holy ignorance," and this remark remained in history. At the height of its power, the church was very wealthy, owning about a third of all the land in Europe, making it richer than many kings. Just imagine the power it had to eliminate anyone who opposed it easily. You might think this was a long time ago, but no, even in the 17th and 18th centuries, the church still had a lot of power. For example, when Charles Darwin proposed the theory of evolution in 1859, he himself said it felt like confessing to murder. Only because he was English and the church had less power in England did he survive. One of the most horrific events during the Middle Ages was the Black Plague. This disease reached Europe in the 14th century. In 1347, through trade routes, especially the Silk Road, by 1351, at its peak, it had killed about 50 million people, almost 1/3 to half of Europe's population. To understand how fast it spread, in some cities, 7,000 people died in one day. Imagine waking up every morning, not knowing who would die that day, maybe your neighbor, your family, or even yourself. If a family member fell ill and was near death, there were no doctors since religion had the solution. You had to go to the church and ask them to pray for the sick. The Black Plague took about 400 years to completely disappear from Europe, killing an estimated 200 million people during that time. But finally, after centuries of darkness, a light appeared on the horizon. From the late 14th century, a movement called the Renaissance began. Renaissance means rebirth, like Europe waking up from a long sleep. The Renaissance started in Italy. But why Italy? Because it was full of ancient Roman artifacts. Everywhere they dug, they found a statue or an old column. These artifacts made artists and scholars think about how things were made in the past, sparking a revival of science and art. Artists and scholars began asking questions that no one had dared to ask before, thinking about humanity and its place in the world. One of the most significant events of the Renaissance was the invention of the printing press. Before that, books were handwritten, a very long and expensive process. But with the printing press, books suddenly became cheaper and widespread, making knowledge and information more accessible to people. Before the printing press, a monk might spend his entire life writing one book. For example, writing a copy of the Bible took about 20 years, but with the printing press, 300 pages could be printed in one day, revolutionizing the world of books and knowledge. Great artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo emerged during this period. They weren't just painters, they knew everything in painting, sculpture, architecture, engineering. Da Vinci had designs for flying machines, helicopters, tanks, and even robots. Of course, no one at the time knew what these were. People thought Da Vinci was crazy, but now we know how genius he was. Da Vinci even designed a diving suit, including a leather helmet, vest, pants, shoes, mask, and air tank. He even thought about possible problems, designing a system to quickly get out of the suit if water pressure got too high, showing his attention to detail. But Da Vinci wasn't alone. Other artists were changing the world too, like Michelangelo. This man was a giant in the art world. Have you seen the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel? Michelangelo spent 4 years on scaffolding to paint those incredible pictures. He designed a special scaffolding system to work more comfortably, lying on it to paint. He even made a special hat to hold candles so he could work at night. This shows that Renaissance artists weren't just artists, they were inventors too. The Renaissance wasn't limited to art. Science was advancing too. One of the most important scientists of this era was Galileo, who can be considered the father of modern science. He was the first to use a telescope to study the sky. He found that the moon had a rough surface full of mountains and valleys, and that Jupiter had moons. These discoveries were crucial because they showed that Earth wasn't the center of the universe, contrary to what the Church claimed. However, these discoveries came at a high cost for Galileo. The Church accused him of heresy and forced him to recant. Galileo had to say he was wrong, but they say he muttered, "And yet it moves," as he left the court, meaning no matter how much the Church denied it, Earth revolves around the sun. Interestingly, Galileo didn't just get into trouble for his astronomical observations. He conducted experiments challenging Aristotle's theory of falling objects, which stated that heavier objects fall faster. But Galileo showed this wasn't true by allegedly dropping 2 balls of different weights from the Leaning Tower of Pisa and seeing them hit the ground simultaneously. These experiments and observations led people to start questioning what they had been told, sparking a scientific revolution that led to the Enlightenment. The Renaissance didn't stay in Italy. It gradually spread to the rest of Europe. In England, Shakespeare emerged, writing plays that still, after 400 years, impact people. Hamlet, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet are just a few of his masterpieces. Shakespeare even added about 1,700 new words to the English language. Meanwhile, as these cultural transformations were happening, the world was also getting bigger. Explorers like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama were discovering new continents. These discoveries introduced Europeans to new cultures and broadened their horizons. However, these explorations weren't always positive. Colonialism and slavery were dark outcomes of this period. Europeans used their advanced technology to occupy other lands and enslave their people, a black mark in European history whose effects are still felt today. Despite this, it's undeniable that the Renaissance was a turning point in human history, laying the foundations of the modern world. Science, art, literature all flourished during this period, paving the way for future advancements. Now, we can see how much the world has changed and how far humanity has come. So next time you're complaining about life, remember it could have been much worse. You could have lived in the Middle Ages, where a small cut could cost you your life, or during the Black Plague, waking up each morning not knowing if you'd survive the day. Thanks for joining us on this historical journey. If you have any thoughts or ideas, let us know in the comments, and we'll make a video about them. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe.